Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation entitled Place They Can Go, Community-Based Prevention Strategies for Youth Homelessness in Rural Canada. I just wanted to also thank the CAEH for having me today. So I'm up in Southampton, which is a small town on the shores of Lake Huron. So I just want to do a land acknowledgement for the area that I'm presenting from. I, Hart Walker, he, him, acknowledge my presence on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, known as the People of the Three Fires, including the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. I further acknowledge the Sagi and Ojibwe Nation as the traditional caretakers of this land. So I'll just give a brief introduction. My name is Hart Walker. I'm a PhD candidate, hopefully almost finished, in sociology at York University in Toronto. I was recently hired as evaluation coordinator for making the shift in Toronto. My methodological focus is on program evaluation and community-based research. For my dissertation research, I focused on rural youth homelessness, particularly the access to and utilization of programs and services in the area where I currently live, focusing on mental health services. I'm very interested in the relationship between youth homelessness and mental illness and how the two tend to influence one another. I'm also really interested in sense of identity, community, and belonging that individuals have, and how that helps them face the challenges they face when experiencing homelessness. So I'll talk a little bit about the rural context to start. The definition of rural is, as you can probably imagine, there are a lot of competing definitions. There still isn't one single definition that's commonly used. For our purposes here, the sort of general definition is that rural areas are lower population density areas that tend to be more geographically remote. They tend to be based on sort of single resource-based economies and tend to have notable cultural differences from urban areas. Rural demographics, also a lot of differences there. Residents in rural areas tend to have, generally speaking, lower incomes, lower levels of educational attainment, not as good access to health services. The housing landscape is also somewhat different. There tends to be a much smaller stock of rental housing in rural areas. And so it's usually around 80% single detached dwellings, 20% rental housing. That percentage is not consistent across the board, but it tends to be around those percentages in terms of housing availability. These areas are often characterized by seasonal and resource-based industries. Cultural attitudes and self-perceptions tend also to be different. There's sort of an emphasis on self-sufficiency, but also a kind of emphasis on a kind of more neighborliness or community ethos that tends to characterize rural areas. They tend to see themselves as sort of quieter, more idyllic places, often where problems like homelessness don't necessarily even exist. So my focus was on youth homelessness in these areas. There's very little research on this in Canada, almost none actually. what we do know on what little research exists in Canada and some other Western countries is that youth homelessness tends to manifest itself more in rural areas as hidden homelessness, which is kind of a form of temporary, more precarious housing. You might have heard the term couch surfing. It's usually characterized by people staying with family, friends, or even acquaintances for an indeterminate period of time. People experiencing hidden homelessness also often don't necessarily perceive themselves as homeless either. So this tends to be kind of the most major form of homelessness that that happens in rural areas. The economic and cultural dimension is also not necessarily positive for youth in these areas. There tend to be less jobs and less of a housing stock that's appropriate for youth. The cultural dimension of youth homelessness is that it's often a double-edged sword. People tend to again, that community ethos has people from small communities often rallying around problems like youth homelessness to help people. But the other side of that is that those efforts are often characterized by political and religious conservatism. And they also tend to, because of the cultural emphases on self-sufficiency, they tend to individualize the problem of homelessness, blaming it on individual choices as opposed to systemic factors. And of course, the service coordination and availability of a lot of different types of services like health and housing services tends to not be as robust in these areas, and a lot of this is due to a lack of government funding. So I did my research in Bruce and Grey counties, Ontario, which, as you can see on this little map of the municipalities here, that these counties are together between Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. Combining the two counties, it's a population of a little under 162,000. There are two Indigenous reserves in the area as well, the Saugeen First Nation and the Nawash First Nation. There's a lot of course, seasonal tourism and cottaging in this area during summers. There's also a growing retirement population, meaning that a lot of the population in sort of more southern parts of southwestern Ontario, like Toronto, Kitchener, Hamilton, a lot of them have moved up to this area or similar areas for their retirement. There does tend to be less economic diversity in rural areas, and Bruce and Grey counties is no different. It relies heavily on the energy sector as well as the health sector. Now, I actually did my own research in two phases. I'm only going to focus on the second phase, which was the qualitative component, which was a strengths-based community needs assessment that I conducted. It consisted of 18 semi-structured interviews among service providers, youth support workers, and individuals with lived experience of homelessness. Most of the questions that I asked had to do with the sort of gaps in services addressing youth homelessness, but also community strengths as well as potential solutions that respondents thought might be viable to address youth homelessness in the area. So there were 6 major problem areas identified through these interviews. One was mental health and addiction services. Emergency housing was another big one. The emergency housing system is a motel system, which tends to house people for anywhere between a few days to a few weeks. I think all but one of the respondents that I interviewed thought this system was very inadequate for dealing with the problem of youth homelessness and even homelessness more generally. Service collaboration was identified as a problem, not because service providers weren't able to collaborate. Most of them said that they actually collaborate very well. They also said that their job roles and the mandates of their respective organizations often got in the way of them collaborating more efficiently. A lack of housing was, of course, identified. Funding and organizational capacity, again, is limited, largely because these areas receive less funding. And then some respondents also identified Indigenous and visible minority discrimination for both for housing and access to services as being a problem in this area. When I asked about the strengths that they thought they had to cope with these issues, there was a kind of broad category of acceptance, listening, and caring. The service providers often saw themselves as very empathetic and very accepting of youth who were experiencing homelessness. Volunteering and community was identified as a strength. People said that their organizations often relied heavily on volunteers and other community members. They also identified their ability to stretch funds, their ability to improvise and use funding in creative ways to deal with the fact that they really received a limited amount of funding. And then strength they identified was the strength-based approach itself. So as opposed to thinking of their organizations or their areas having deficits, they tended to think more about what the strengths were so that they could, again, use those strengths to kind of deal with the problem in more creative ways. So we come now to the question that I started the presentation with, which is how can we prevent rural youth homelessness? Again, this was something that I asked respondents, and there were 4 more common answers. One was that they thought that host homes, which we'll get to in a minute, would potentially be a very effective solution for rural youth homelessness prevention. Youth drop-in centers were often something that were mentioned as something that was needed. Early childhood prevention was another frequently mentioned category. So kind of addressing early on in childhood the problems that gradually over time lead to youth homelessness. A lot of service providers and individuals with lived experience that I talked with, thought that this was something that should be focused on. And of course, mental health supports and services were also frequently mentioned, usually just getting more of them and more kind of personnel to deal with that part of the issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about host homes. There isn't any research that I've come across at least in a Canadian context, that looks at the application of host homes to a rural area. However, in the past few years, there has been kind of an acceleration of evaluation research on this idea in urban contexts. So the main idea behind host homes is that one is that they would divert youth from shelters. Shelters tend to be potentially very dangerous for youth and can often absorb them more in street life and all the dangers that come with that, like economic and sexual exploitation. Shelters tend to increase the chances that youth will become involved in street culture, and so host homes have shown that they can potentially divert a lot of youth experiencing homelessness from shelters, and also reduce their reliance on emergency services that are commonly accessed by homeless youth. They're community-based, not only in the sense that they connect youth to the wider community, but they also tend to connect adults to the community more and community issues, and kind of heightens their awareness of youth homelessness and the problems related to it. It provides youth with a safe, comfortable, encouraging home environment, and the research also shows that it tends to reconnect youth with natural supports like friends and family, as well as the larger community. So it can really enhance their social capital. So I've provided some resources here to if you want to read more about host home programs, or read more research related to the programs. This was sort of the number one idea that was mentioned by respondents in the research that I did, both service providers and youth with lived experience. And I think it could be a very promising kind of program applied in a rural environment. So thank you very much for coming. And I will now take questions.